Here we have the method to produce an apple tart tatin. An apple tart tatin is a classic French dish made with caramelised apples and butter puff pastry. It's made by rolling out some puff pastry, and in this case we're using butter puff pastry because it creates a better flavour. When you're dealing with only a couple of ingredients, it's important that you're using the best quality ingredients available. It's a bit tricky to work with butter puff pastry, especially if it gets a little bit warm. So it's advised that you roll it out in a cool environment and try and work with it reasonably quickly. Here we have it rolling it out, trying to keep an even sort of thickness. You need to roll it out to about 4 millimeters thick. That should be fine. Before we cut it out, it's important that we allow the pastry to rest and relax the gluten. So we're just rolling it up here in some greaseproof paper, and that'll go back in the fridge. If for some reason we were to cut our pastry just after rolling it out, the pastry would shrink, and in this case you want a round disc. The problem here, if you have a look at this next clip, if you cut it straight away, it sort of turns into more of an oval shape. It's not really appropriate. While it's resting, you need to get together the rest of the ingredients, which are a couple of apples, Granny Smith has recommended, some butter and sugar. We then peel the apples, cut the peeled apple into quarters, and remove the core from inside of it. The quarters of apples are then cut into about 3 or 4 slices, as shown in the following little clip. If you work them reasonably quickly, you won't need to put them into acidulated water. It's best to cut the apple and cook it straight away, but if you can't, for whatever reason, you need to store them in some water with a little bit of lemon juice in it. We then go over to the stove and put some caster sugar directly into a black pan, or a stainless steel pan is probably even better because you can actually see the sugar caramelising. It's a little bit difficult in a black pan. You just see that little bit of smoke coming off. You know that the caramel is actually reasonably dark, and that's quite important because the darkness or the richness of the caramel helps counteract with the richness of the puff pastry. Once we get to the correct colour, we then flick in a little bit of butter and then swirl it in. That stops the cooking process, and the sugar sort of turns into more of like a lava-like consistency. Just sort of monteing the butter into it, and then we add the apples and cook them through. It's important that we cook the apple out, because what happens during the cooking process is some of the natural water or juices in the apple will come out and actually blend with the caramel and create a syrup. It's this syrup that is placed on the bottom of the dish with the apples, and later on it becomes the sauce for the dish. So it's important that we just slowly cook them out and don't rush this process, otherwise you won't be left with any sauce later on. There you go, just cooking it out a little bit there. You can just sort of see some of the liquid coming out on the bottom of the pan now. There's a wee snapshot of what it should look like once it's actually cooked out. And then we pack our apples into a little dish. In this case this is the Teflon coated dish, so it's non-stick, but any sort of dish will do. We're making individual tart tatins in this situation here. You could arrange them in quite a decorative pattern on the bottom, but just placing them in will be fine, because normally this would be served with, say, a little ball of vanilla bean ice cream on top, or something similar. So the next shot here, we're just pouring in some of that sauce, and it's important that we have a reasonable amount of that sauce, because in many ways it self-sauces itself later on. It's important to allow that mixture to cool down before we try to place the puff pastry lid over the top. Just notice there we're tucking the pastry around the sides, and that will sort of encapsulate the little tart tatin as it cooks and bakes. There we have it there. Once that's been placed on, we make a little hole to let any steam come out during the cooking process, and they'll be then placed onto a tray and into an oven. Here we are repeating the process again with a second tart tatin. It can be quite tricky to work with if those apples are still warm, especially using butter puff pastry. There we go. So they're placed onto a tray with a lip, which is quite handy because often some of the sauce will boil over in the cooking process, because we need to cook puff pastry at about 220. so sometimes there can be a bit of overcooking. There you go, you can sort of see them. They've been about a couple of minutes and the pastry's just starting to lift now. That's probably about 5 minutes later, and in the next clip this is about 12 minutes later, so they really have puffed up quite a lot. It's important that they're really quite dark, the pastry, especially if you're using butter puff pastry, we get a nice crispy texture. To remove them from the pan, we place them onto a gas ring and just shake them, and then we turn them out onto a warm plate, being that they are a warm dessert. And there we have it, the classic Tart Tatin. And there's a picture of the finished product. Got a couple of handy hints here to help you out with your assessment. So make sure that you rest that pastry before you cut it, otherwise it'll shrink. Make sure that the sugar's nice and dark when you cook it, that way you'll get the best flavour. Try and make sure that there's enough syrup in the dish so that later on it'll self-sauce. And make sure that the pastry is definitely cooked until well crisp. And always serve on a warm plate.